Okay, you guys, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody, and thank you guys for coming. As you guys know, this conference is entitled 40 Years After Milliken, Remedying Racial Disparities in the PostRacial Society. And my name is Ismara Carbado. I'm gonna be the managing editor next year for the Journal for Racial and Ethnic Justice. And I will be introducing our speaker for the day, the keynote speaker, Dr. Laura McNeil. Dr. Laura McNeil is currently an assistant law professor at the University of Louisville-Brandeis School of Law, and also serves as a senior fellow at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute here at Harvard Law School. Prior to her work here, Dr. McNeil served as a visiting professor at Michigan State University College of Law. She has also worked as a professor of urban education at the Michigan State University College of Education, which has been ranked #1 by the U.S. News and World Report rankings for the past 17 consecutive years. During her tenure in the MSU, Dr. McNeil worked as a lead faculty member with the Future Teachers for Social Justice Grant Program. Through this program, Dr. McNeil worked with the high school students in Detroit to increase their academic readiness for college and encourage them to pursue careers in teaching. Additionally, she helped develop the curriculum for a 5-year, $5 million grant pipeline program in the College of Education at Michigan State University. Dr. McNeil has also served in the faculty in the Department of Education Policy Studies at Georgia State University, where she taught education law, policy, and leadership courses. Dr. McNeil received her Juris Doctorate from Washington University, St. Louis, and a PhD in Education Administration and Foundations from Illinois State University. As you'll notice from her presentation today, she utilizes an interdisciplinary approach to examine how various laws and policies influence access to education and employment for people from traditionally marginalized communities. She has lectured widely and contributes to the national debate on law and education policy through op-eds and media appearances. Please welcome Dr. Laura McNeil.
Good afternoon. Wow, that was a great introduction. I was actually feeling a little old as I was sitting over there. I'm like, wow, I graduated quite some time ago. I'd like to thank the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Studies, and a special thanks to Ms. Sabrina El Amin for the opportunity to speak here today. As she mentioned, I am a senior fellow here at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, and so I always feel like I'm at home whenever I'm in the Boston area. The title of my talk today is From Hollow Hope to New Beginnings, Equal Education Opportunity in the Post-Milliken Era. As the conference theme highlights, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the landmark Milliken v. Bradley decision, which significantly impacted efforts to create diverse and equitable schools. Today I will be discussing the challenges in achieving educational equity, how the court's decisions in the post-Milliken era have contributed to those challenges, and then how can we overcome those challenges and achieve equal education opportunity in light of the current legal, social, and political constraints that are preventing that from happening. I'm going to use the Milliken v. Bradley decision to sort of frame my talk today. Many legal scholars describe the Milliken decision as destroying the mechanisms needed to fulfill the promise of Brown and leaving instead the facade of equal education opportunity still standing. The Milliken decision sent a daunting blow to creating diverse and equitable schools by eliminating the most and oftentimes only effective desegregation remedy for many racially segregated school districts by removing the opportunity or the ability for school leaders to use an inter-district remedy. In this case, the court reviewed a desegregation plan that was designed to address the intentional discrimination by the Detroit Board of Education as well as the state of Michigan to create not only residential segregation, but racially segregated schools as well. The lower courts determined that an effective remedy could not be developed without including suburban school districts, which had predominantly white populations, to desegregate Detroit public schools, which had predominantly black populations. Imagine you're in a school district where you have, again, a student population that's not racially diverse and you're trying to integrate the schools. It's literally impossible to do so without drawing upon the resources, or rather students from those predominantly white suburbs, to create, again, these diverse and equitable school environments. So the Supreme Court in Milliken essentially undermined desegregation efforts by holding that plaintiffs must first prove an intra-district violation remedy because the constitutional violation must determine the remedy scope. So essentially, the Supreme Court, in their Milliken decision, by not allowing school districts to use the inter-district remedy, turned a blind eye to the contextual realities of Detroit public schools. Essentially, what they did is they removed the only tool that school leaders had to, again, create a diverse learning environment for their students. The court allowed schools which represented the Plessy v. Ferguson era of separate and inherently unequal to continue to persist. So what did this mean? How did the country perceive the court's decision? Essentially what it did is it sent both a symbolic and substantive message that not only would separate and inherently unequal schools be allowed to continue to persist, but they would be tolerated by the highest court in the nation. When I think of how the Milliken decision fits into the overall framework of educational equity, I'm reminded of the power of education. I'm reminded how powerful education is in ensuring that every child has the ability to receive, or rather to achieve, their highest potential. I'm reminded of my grandmother and namesake, Laura B. McNeil. Born in 1912, my grandmother was a pioneer in the field of education. She received her bachelor's degree in education from Florida A&M University and a master's degree in educational leadership from Florida A&M University. Following the historic Brown v. Board of Education decision, my grandmother received a phone call one day. It was from her superintendent. He said, "Laura, I'm hearing all of this noise and commotion about being forced to desegregate our schools. If our children are forced to go to school with your Negro children, your Negro degree from Florida A&M won't count, and you will lose your job." My grandmother paused, hung up the phone, and the first thing that came to mind is what her mother told her so many years ago. Education is the key to overcoming barriers such as racism and discrimination. So what did my grandmother do? Every summer for the next 2 summers, she traveled to Columbia University in New York. She left her family behind, and she received her second degree in master's in educational leadership from Columbia University. So when the schools desegregated after the Brown II decision, in which they ordered schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed, my grandmother was the only Black principal in Polk County, Florida, to keep her job. Now, what did this mean for the students in the school districts? It meant a lot. It meant that my grandmother was there in the midst of the chaos of trying to desegregate schools. Her students, when I run into them in the grocery stores, when I'm home visiting, they still say, "Your grandmother was the calm in the midst of the storm. Your grandmother's presence reminded us constantly that if we stuck to this, if we dug in, that we too could achieve our dreams and overcome the barriers of racism and discrimination through a quality education." So my grandmother's story is really what has motivated me in my passion for pursuing equal education opportunity and doing whatever I can within my power to ensure that it happens. Although my grandmother's experience with race occurred over 50 years ago, race still plays a significant role in education, especially in relation to students of color. The power of education to help us transcend beyond political, social, and structural barriers, to build doors of opportunity where there are none, to eradicate gatekeeping mechanisms that prevent underrepresented minorities from getting into certain fields, still holds true today. Education is still the most powerful tool in fighting for educational equity. So to highlight the context of today's schools, I think it's important to briefly take a look at what the landscape looks like with respect to the post-Milliken era. Keep in mind, it's 40 years after the decision, so you would hope that after 40 years we've made some substantial progress with respect to equal education opportunity. So a cursory review of the educational milieu reveals that our education system is in a crisis. This is not a secret to any of you. We've seen the education crisis played out either in the news, in print media, or in documentaries such as Waiting for Superman. Others have seen the tragic education system played out in their own communities, which translates into high school dropout rates, as well as low-performing schools with respect to achievement outcomes. But 4 components I think are really important to emphasize that really kind of capture what today's educational landscape looks like. Those 4 components are the opportunity gap, unequal distribution of resources, racially segregated schools, and the school-to-prison pipeline. So one of the most heavily discussed problems in education out of all of these is the opportunity gap. The opportunity gap between students of color and their white peers is not a new phenomenon. To the contrary, the disparities in educational opportunities have persisted since the historic Brown v. Board of Education decision. Students of color continue to lag behind their white peers in terms of high school graduation, standardized testing, and college degree attainment. Additionally, many of our high poverty, high minority schools still have not been fixed in terms of equalizing the opportunities that students who achieve those schools receive. Instead of having these schools be turned into productive learning centers, they've been turned into school-to-prison pipelines, a gateway to the criminal justice system. Lastly, segregated schools are inferior schools, and as a result, it's no surprise that we see the continued persistence of the opportunity gap. I'm always entertained when I watch some of the news commentary and I hear they'll have these different education scholars on, giving all these suggestions and theories about why we have the opportunity gap, more than 50 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And to me, it's very clear. When you have racially segregated schools that receive less funding, with larger classroom sizes. I remember with the work that I've done in Detroit, still being troubled by these high school students telling me, Professor McNeil, we're missing pages in our textbook. We have to swap books with these other kids because they may have a page we need so that we can complete our school assignments. I still remember a school in Detroit where the kids told me, which I was just outraged, that the bathrooms were not working, the toilets. So they had a special pass where they would walk 2 blocks down the street to use the bathroom in the elementary schools. And so it's shocking to me that in a country as wealthy as the United States of America that we would have schools operating on the level of a third world country. Although the opportunity gap, segregated schools, and the unequal distribution of resources and the school-to-prison pipeline collectively shape the current educational landscape, I do believe that racially segregated schools is the tie that binds. Racially segregated schools provide poor and students of color with an inferior education and serves as a breeding ground for the opportunity gap, for the school-to-prison pipeline, and for some of the other ills that are preventing a quality of education in our K-12 schools. So let's just take a moment and look at the prevalence of K-12 segregated schools today. I thought it would be helpful to look at the education statistics in 1974 when the historic Milliken v. Bradley case was decided, and 2014. So as you can see from the pie chart that I have behind me, in 1974 in the city of Detroit, there were approximately 72% African American students attending Detroit public schools, and 26% were white. If you fast forward to 2014, instead of there being 72%, there are over 90% of Black and Hispanic students currently attending Detroit public schools. And so I find these statistics to be quite alarming and powerful because they illustrate the court's failure to address the dual education system between the haves and have-nots, and how the court has allowed schools to become more segregated today than they were in 1974. What would Detroit public schools look like today if the Milliken court had permitted multi-district segregation plans to create diverse and equitable schools? When I look at the statistics behind me, I have to ask the question, What would the city of Detroit look like today with a higher number of educated citizens that are employable and able to contribute to the economic growth and prosperity of the city? What would race relations look like today in the city of Detroit if today's generation had been educated in a diverse learning environment? Would the recent incident with the Michigan motorist who was driving and a young man accidentally stepped out in front of his truck and he hit the little boy, he got outside of his truck to make sure the little boy was okay, and he was unfortunately attacked by a mob of angry residents. And there are some racial dynamics with respect to this tragic accident because the driver was white and the mob of people, mob-like behavior that we saw were African Americans. So again, I have to beg the question, what would the city of Detroit look like if Milliken had been decided correctly? If we look beyond the walls of the city of Detroit into some of our other large urban school districts, we see the same disturbing trend. Detroit mirrors the same lack of diversity, the same racially inherently unequal schools as Atlanta public school districts and Chicago public school districts. As you see, more than 80% of the of the students in both school districts, meaning Chicago and Atlanta, are African American. And so again, we're seeing this very disturbing trend, and it's really showing the significance of what the Milliken decision has done in terms of undermining the promise of Brown v. Board of Education. As I talk about the rapid resegregation of K-12 public schools, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the significance of poverty. In those two school districts, 80% of the students attending Detroit public schools, Atlanta public schools, and Detroit public schools are on free and reduced lunch. And so one can actually predict the quality of education that a child receives based on the wealth and racial demographics of a child's neighborhood. Although some education scholars attempt to dismiss the significance of race and poverty, I think the significance is undeniable. According to education scholar Charles Willey, racial disparities and achievement gaps occur due to a higher incidence of poverty among minority households. The number of minorities living in poverty has significantly increased in recent years due to the economic recession, which has, again, undermined education efforts by increasingly placing students of color at a higher risk for not receiving a quality education. According to a report that was released in 2013 by the Census Bureau, approximately 46.5 million Americans are living in poverty. 46.5 million Americans. Although the number of Americans living in poverty is alarming, the impact on children is insurmountable. Currently, 16 million children live in households where median income is below the federal poverty level. Statistics released by the National Poverty Center indicate that more than 50% of African Americans and Hispanics are living in poverty compared to 9% of their white peers. Another report released revealed that 1 in 3 African American children and 1 in 4 Latino children are living in poverty. Both rates are more than double that of their white peers. When I think about the injustice that is going on in our education system with respect to the influence of poverty and separate and unequal schools, the first thing that comes to mind is what role has the court played in fighting equal education opportunity or fighting for equal education opportunity? Historically, our courts have played a very integral role in protecting the rights of students who are denied an education because of a disability, a language deficiency, or race. This is primarily due to the court's position, which is they're in a position to enact widespread reform through their judicial decisions. Thus, in examining the state of equal education opportunity in the post-Milliken era, I think it's important to ask again what roles the court has or has not played, rather, in promoting educational equity. Unfortunately, in the post-Milliken era, the courts have maintained as opposed to eliminated racially segregated schools through a series of decisions that limited the use of race-conscious measures to remedy segregated schools. Specifically, the San Antonio v. Rodriguez case, the parents involved case, as well as the recent Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin case, has really contributed to the demise of educational equity here in the United States. A prevailing theme among these three cases is the pursuit of equity under the guise of neutrality, which again has severely limited the options available to school leaders to create diverse and equitable schools. I think it's helpful if I just briefly summarize some of these cases so you can see how collectively they've helped build the crisis we're in today. San Antonio v. Rodriguez. The plaintiffs in the San Antonio case challenged the constitutionality of the state of Texas's school funding scheme. In addition to being funded through a state-funded program that gave schools a minimum educational threshold, Texas public and elementary and secondary schools also relied very heavily on property taxes. Now, initially when you hear this, you might think, well, that's great, this is supplemental income, it's gonna help the children with respect to, help the schools have more resources for children. But what happened in the state of Texas is that students that were in the wealthier school districts, ironically, obviously received more funding than students that were in the poorer districts. Based on the case facts, students in the 10 wealthiest districts in the state of Texas received an average per pupil expenditure, in addition to what they were receiving from the state, of $610 per student. To the contrary, the students in the wealthier districts received $63 per student. So imagine what you can do with $610 per pupil expenditure and $63 per pupil expenditure. So how did this look? What you saw were schools in the wealthier districts that had amazing facilities, smaller class sizes, amazing after-school programs, tutorial programs. They had up-to-date textbooks. And in the poorer districts, you saw schools barely struggling to stay open. You saw schools with extremely large class sizes, high numbers of underqualified teachers. You saw schools with no tutorial program. And what's so disturbing about the state of Texas is the schools that needed the help the most in the poorer districts, the schools where parents often didn't have a high school diploma, so they couldn't help their child with their homework, after schools. They were not in a position to help them with respect to their achievement. Those are the schools that needed the help the most, yet those were the schools that received the least amount of funding and resources in the state of Texas. So therefore, the San Antonio School District, on behalf of its students in the poorer district, challenged this funding scheme, arguing that it underprivileged such students because of the lack, again, of vast property tax base in their communities, and as a result created severe inter-district disparities with respect to their student funding. So the issue essentially was whether the Texas funding scheme that created these inter-district disparities by relying on local property taxes for per pupil expenditures violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court, unfortunately, upheld the constitutionality of the Texas funding scheme and its disparate impact on socially, economically disadvantaged students, most of whom were students of color. Additionally, in reaching their decision, the Rodriguez court rejected the notion of a fundamental right to education, stating that the Constitution did not grant that right neither explicitly or implicitly. The court held that poor urban students did not have a fundamental right to receive the same equal education opportunity as their wealthier counterparts under the 14th Amendment. As you can imagine, many education advocates and scholars heavily criticized the court's decision as one that was going to perpetuate the unequal education system that was already flourishing. So when I think of the Rodriguez decision, what it means to me is it's a missed opportunity. And what do I mean by a missed opportunity? It's a missed opportunity for the court to provide leaders with a legal tool that would once and for all allow them to fulfill the promise of Brown. Instead, the court chose to not acknowledge the contextual realities of Texas public schools and chose to simply look the other way, the same way they did in the Milliken decision, the same way they did in the next court decision I'm going to discuss, which is the parents involved case. The Rodriguez decision demystified hegemonic notions that every child should have access to a quality education. Additionally, the biggest message that the Rodriguez court sent out to the nation is that separate, unequal, racially segregated schools with high poverty populations were not only acceptable, but again would be endorsed by the court. And they did the same thing in Parents Involved. So Parents Involved versus Seattle Public Schools, the issue in this case was whether a school district school assignment plan that used race as a tiebreaker could be used without being considered in violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. In this case, Seattle Public School Districts had a very unique situation. Essentially, you had a school district that was segregated by racial housing patterns. You had the majority of African American students concentrated in the north and the majority of white students concentrated in the south. And this was very problematic because it created de facto segregation with respect to the school compositions. And so Seattle thought, you know what, we're going to figure out a way to create diverse and equitable schools. And so part of their school assignment plan essentially would allow students to choose which school they wanted to attend. And what would happen is oftentimes the most popular schools would become oversubscribed, meaning more students wanting to attend those schools than were available spots for the students. And so in an effort to create a student composition that was 60% African American and 40% white, they would use a racial tiebreaker. And what's really interesting about the Parents Involved case is that they tried to model their student assignment plan after the Grutter decision, and they also considered other factors, such as is there another sibling attending the school? Is this a single-parent family? So there were other factors that the school districts used in determining whether or not to allow the child to attend this particular school. Where it got a little bit sticky is when, again, race was used as the actual tiebreaker to make that decision. So the court and Parents Involved applied a strict scrutiny framework and found that the district's racial tiebreaker plan was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court acknowledged that it had previously held that racial diversity can be a compelling governmental interest in university admissions, but ruled that the present case was not governed by Grutter. Unlike the cases pertaining to higher education, the district court's goal of preventing racial imbalance based on the Parents Involved court did not meet the court's standards for a constitutional, legitimate, or rather permissible use of race. Interestingly enough, in this case, in a separate concurring opinion in this judgment, Justice Kennedy actually agreed with the district court's use of race was unconstitutional, meaning their decision that it was unconstitutional. But Kennedy stressed that the public schools may sometimes consider race conscious measures to achieve a diverse and equitable schools. But the problem with Kennedy's concurring opinion is he fails to articulate how to do that in a way that would withstand constitutional scrutiny. He does mention things such as how we draw attendance lines. In the aftermath of the Parents Involved decision, certain school districts, such as Wake County schools, have tried things such as using socioeconomic status as a means of achieving diverse and equitable schools. And the problem with using socioeconomic status as a part of your decision-making process with school admissions is it doesn't work in all contexts. There are contexts where schools, it's a extremely poor school district, so you have 90% of the students in the school district are on free and reduced lunch, and yet they're racially segregated by their housing patterns. And so using socioeconomic status as an admissions tool in a district that is consists predominantly of poor students does not allow you to achieve the type of racial diversity and the type of integrated learning environment that was fought so hard for in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. The last case I want to talk about is the Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin case. The demise of race-conscious measures with respect to achieving equal education opportunity was further diminished with this particular case. In this case, as most of you are aware, Abigail Fisher attended the University of Texas. She sued the university, challenging the constitutionality of their school admissions process. Specifically, she argued that the University of Texas's policy for admissions exceeded the parameters of Grutter v. Bollinger because the University of Texas had already achieved a diverse student body through their top 10% program, which was race neutral. So essentially what they did is allowed students that graduate in the top 10% of their class to be able to attend or have automatic acceptance into the University of Texas, because if you have schools that are racially segregated, that means that high minority schools are going to get the top 10% of that population, predominantly white schools are going to get the top 10% of that particular population. So essentially, the criteria for selecting the remaining admission spots included a holistic review of many factors, one of which was race. In the Grutter decision, the court held, as you know, that the University of Michigan could consider race as one of many factors in the admissions process to create a diverse student body, because that court emphasized that diversity was a compelling governmental interest. Now, although the Fisher decision court chose to vacate and remand the case to the lower court's ruling, it's important to note that the Fisher court's reasoning for doing so was that the lower court needed to properly evaluate whether the University of Texas satisfied strict scrutiny. Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, stated that strict scrutiny imposes on the university the ultimate burden of demonstrating before turning to racial classifications that available, workable race-neutral alternatives had been considered. Although the Fisher Court affirmed the use of race in the admissions process, the ruling makes it harder for institutions to use race-conscious measures because it imposed a stricter standard that places the burden again on universities to show that there are no workable race-neutral alternatives. The Fisher ruling serves as both a substantive and symbolic message that despite the racial disparities that continue to permeate the United States education system, that this court is again choosing to ignore the significance of race in those educational outcomes. So again, we see the court applying these race-neutral jurisprudence despite the awareness of the inability of these approaches to enact meaningful change. Race-neutral approaches, as I stated, did not work in Milliken, did not work in Parents Involved. So collectively, the San Antonio case, the Parents Involved case, and the Fisher case have undermined efforts to achieve educational equity under this notion of colorblind rhetoric. So in discussing some of the challenges that courts have provided or presented in achieving equal education opportunity, I think it's important to kind of summarize it up and highlight. You know, in light of these court decisions, what are the challenges to equal education opportunity? And I've pulled out these three core things. The first one, the court's endorsement of colorblind rhetoric. The second, the court's deliberate indifference to the contextual realities of K-12 schools. And lastly, the unequal distribution of resources that we saw that resulted from the Rodriguez decision. So in considering these three things, the question I have today is, how do we go from hollow hope to new beginnings? How do we change the hollow hope that many students in these failing, racially segregated schools experience every day when they enter the schoolhouse doors that are inferior and that send messages of inferiority to them, that you're not worth investing in, that you're not worth receiving a high-quality education, that you're not worth having the same facilities, resources that the students do in the suburban schools? I think the way that we can achieve this goal is three things. One, we must debunk notions of a post-racial society. If I hear one more person say, we have reached the the Mecca. We have reached the post-racial society. After all, we have a black president. My mother often teases me, we joke around, and she says, the post-racial society to America begun on the day that President Barack Obama was inaugurated. And so it's very, very important that we dispel these myths and force the judicial system as well as society at large to acknowledge that race still matters and still plays a very intricate role in determining the outcomes of children's education. Second, recognizing education as a fundamental right. And lastly, reframing the education crisis. So I'm going to start out with the first bullet, debunking notions of a post-racial society. So what we've seen is through these cases is the court's departure from acknowledging the significance of race and essentially pretending that color doesn't matter. As you see by the quotes that I have behind me, in 1978, Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun stated, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take into account race. There is no other way. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must treat them differently." Now let's fast forward from 1978 to 2007. We have Justice Roberts saying, "The only way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." So you can see the court's departure from acknowledging the significance of race and supporting race-conscious means to remedy both past and present discrimination. And I find these changing or shifting paradigms to be very disturbing because it is taking us further and further away from remedying the crisis that we have in our education system. In debunking these notions of a post-racial society, I found this quote in a recent Washington Post article that I found to be quite intriguing. It was by the gentleman Von Spassky, and he said, quote, "The students who are applying into college today are born in the 1990s, during the age of systemic discrimination, something that disappeared decades ago. They come from families whose parents are doctors or lawyers and haven't suffered the kind of discrimination that was occurring in the 1950s and 1960s. And so my initial response when reading this in the Washington Post was, what planet is he living on? It was just amazing how he could be so disconnected to the contextual realities that are going on within society at large. Pretending that we're in a post-racial society and that we're colorblind is like pretending that color doesn't exist. The reality is we're not colorblind. We attach certain stereotypes, assumptions to certain groups of people, and whether it's explicitly or implicitly through things such as implicit bias, it does impact how we interact with people, the opportunities we provide people with, and the doors of opportunity that people are able to enter. So in debunking this notion of a post-racial society, I just wanted to briefly highlight some very strong empirical evidence that states the obvious. First, the black to white ratio of unemployment between blacks and whites. It has remained constant since 1963. 1963. But this can't possibly be because remember, we're in a post-racial society. How do you explain the disparities in unemployment? Additionally, if you look at the annual unemployment rates compared with the average national unemployment rates during the recession, we see the same disturbing trend. African Americans, more than 2 times the amount of unemployment, meaning lack of opportunities, than their white counterparts. These racial disparities in society transcend beyond employment into the healthcare field. If you look at the health insurance coverage by race and ethnicity, again, you can clearly see the glaring disparities of how many African American children, Hispanic children do not have healthcare coverage. How does that translate into educational outcomes? Because students who cannot receive quality education, they have high absenteeism. High absenteeism translates into poor education achievement, poor education outcomes. The racial disparities that demonstrate that we are not in a post-racial society are also evident through the criminal justice system. The prison population grew by 700% from 1970 to 2005, a rate that is outpacing crime and population rates. While people of color only make up about 30% of the United States population, they account for 60% of those imprisoned. According to data released by the Department of Education, African American students are arrested far more than their white classmates. Additionally, data shows that Black and Hispanic students make up 70% of the school-based arrests that are done throughout the country, 70%. Research also shows that African American and Hispanic males receive harsher school punishments, from suspensions to arrest, which have led to the number of youth coming into contact with the juvenile justice system at an early age to be simply astronomical. Furthermore, research has shown that African American youth have higher rates of juvenile incarceration and are more likely to be sentenced to adult prisons. According to the Sentencing Project, even though African American juveniles youth are only about 16% of the youth population, 58% of them end up the number of cases that are sent to adult prisons. So what we see is the school-to-prison pipeline, and how schools are serving as a gateway to the criminal justice system. And so what I find really alarming about the influence of the school-to-prison pipeline and the educational futures of our youth, in my work that I've done in looking at the role of implicit bias with respect to equal education opportunity, what's happening in many states is you have African American youth that are being arrested in school for disorderly conduct. Well, disorderly conduct, as you can imagine, is a pretty subjective term. And so in conducting research in this area, what I've seen that's happening over and over and over again are teachers that are scared of our African American boys. They talk with their hands. I know that when I'm at family events, if you don't talk loud, you will not get a word in. And so we're very expressive, talking with our hands. Well, when you have a 14-year-old boy who's 6'2", 210 pounds, and a little petite teacher, they are scared. And so what you have is this lack of cultural competency that's allowing many teachers to misinterpret students' intentions, and they're perceiving them as being violent or having a propensity for violence. Students have been arrested for disorderly conduct, for paper fights, for raising their voice at a teacher. And where this becomes problematic is when you have a school-based arrest, you go to the juvenile justice system, the judge says, why is this kid here? This is a paper fight, get him out of here. And depending on what state you're in, that arrest record follows you throughout your adult life. Depending on what state you're in, the record is not sealed at the age of 18. Now, granted, the young man wasn't convicted of anything, but he still has an arrest record. And so these are the types of inequities that demonstrate that we are not in a post-racial society and that race still matters. And so, in addition to debunking the post-racial myth, I think it's important also that we recognize the importance of establishing education as a fundamental right. The shortfalls of our education system are disconcerting because democracy and education are inextricably linked. As a nation with a foundation built on democracy, how can we continue to uphold our democratic ideals of freedom, equality, and justice for all with an education system that privileges some while marginalizing others? This notion is best captured in the following quote by Kenneth Galbraith. It reads, "Education makes democracy possible, and along with economic development, it makes it necessary, even inevitable." And so I think it's really important that we recognize education as a fundamental right, and ensuring, that's the only way we can ensure that every child has equal access to the same quality of education, and that is dispensed on equal terms. Lastly, I think it's important that we reframe the education crisis. This year, thousands of students will not graduate from high school. And many people perceive these kids, I've heard them referred to as the throwaway kids, and that they're not worth saving. The reality is these children are worth saving. our children are worth saving, and we can save our nation's children. We have the resources and the innovation to fix the education crisis. And when I think of the education crisis in America and how we need to reframe how we value education, how we approach this problem, I think of it as a bad business plan. Imagine you're a homeowner, a store owner. You have a business plan that's not working. You're losing money every day. You're not getting returns on your investment. And yet, do you continue to use the same bad business plan, or do you recognize that you need an entirely new plan? And that's what we need. We need a new way of framing and viewing and approaching our education system. We see these pockets of successful reform measures, but I ask, why aren't they implemented on a systemic level? You hear about the San Francisco Dream Schools, the KIPP Academies in Atlanta. Why can't we replicate these on a national level? Why is there no sense of alarm with our education crisis? And when I hear people say, it's just too hard, I think if we can go from having cell phones that are the size of small refrigerators to handhelds in less than 10 years, surely we can fix the education crisis. We have to reframe our values and what our country cares about. When I think about the sweeping education measures that have been recently passed with respect to the No Child Left Behind Act and President Obama's Race to the Top initiative, I see a common thread with those two reform measures. Who is at the table making the decisions? Who are developing these education reform measures? They're policymakers, they are lawmakers, legislators. They are people who have not stepped foot in a school since they themselves were students. And so what this has created is a disconnect between the contextual realities and what we need to fix today's schools and what's actually being done. It's this disconnect. The people that should be at the table when we're trying to solve these complex problems are the urban school principals, the teachers that are on the ground level who understand what it takes to turn around a school. Instead, we continue these piecemeal approaches to education. We see hundreds of initiatives rolled out every year, none of them bringing forth the systemic change that we need, the systemic change that was dreamt of with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. None of these achieve the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King thought of when he envisioned an education that was equal on all terms. So where do we go from here? Essentially, I think we have to, in reframing the issue, we have to get people to buy in to the realities that our failing education system affects them as well. It's not an African American problem, it's not a Hispanic problem, it's not a poor people problem. It's an American problem. Because if students of color cannot compete in an increasingly global society, then America cannot compete. Additionally, the economic implications of failing schools is quite daunting. We need to reframe the argument and help people understand what it's going to cost from an economic standpoint if we continue to allow this failing school system to persist. A recent study done by the Center for Labor and Market Statistics at Northeastern University found that each high school dropout cost the nation $1,500 per dropout. Additionally, another study found that high school graduates who actually are able to contribute to the income contribute $5,000 annually. So it can either cost us $1,500 annually, or we can have the contribution of at least $5,000 in taxes each year. Another study found that one cohort of dropouts, meaning for the year, let's say 2011, will cost the country, in terms of their lifetime revenue that they would have contributed to our income base, $329 billion. That's 1 year. 1 year of high school dropouts. Yet despite these daunting statistics and our increased inability to compete in a global society, we still continue to use an education system that does not work. So in conclusion, the best and most effective means of addressing the things that I have focused on today are rejecting notions of a post-racial society, recognizing education as a fundamental right, and reframing how we approach and view education, and making sure that there is a collective effort with respect to making it happen. You know, I think about how we as a country, we pulled together after September 11. There is a sense of collectivism and optimism and hope, and we were able to transcend beyond many of the barriers that had kept us from having this collective spirit within our country. We can do that with education. We can make a difference through collectivism. So I'd like to conclude today with some words from Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. 6 months before he died, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall spoke from Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on July 4th, 1992, when he received the Liberty Bell Award. He described his unfinished journal as follows: "I wish I could say that racism and prejudice were only distant memories, and that liberty and equality were just around the bend. I wish I could say that America has come to appreciate diversity and to see and to accept similarity. But as I look around, I see not a nation of unity, but of division, Afro and white, indigenous and immigrant, rich and poor, illiterate and uneducated. But there is a price to be paid for that division and isolation. We cannot play ostrich. Democracy cannot flourish amid fear. Liberty cannot bloom amid hate. Justice cannot take root amid rage. We must go beyond the prevailing wind. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from apathy. We must dissent from a government that has left our youth without jobs, without education, without hope. We must dissent from the poverty of vision and the absence of moral leadership. We must dissent because America can do better. Take a chance. Knock down the fences that divide. Tear apart the walls that imprison. Reach out, for freedom lies just on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNeil. It was a great presentation. And if we can give her another round of applause. Thank you guys again for coming. And if you aren't familiar, there's other panels and workshops dealing with education, employment, and the criminal justice system. And I really hope you guys get a chance to visit those panels. Thank you again for coming.